Hi again. Now, in this lecture, I want to kind of step away from the whole detail of implementation and coding and look at design. How do we design a React app? How do we come up with a component hierarchy? How do we decide which components are stateful? How do we decide what state variables there should be? All of those issues. Now, the slides for this lecture are behind this card here on the right, and the slides are these ones here. There's no associated code now needed for this set of slides. So the title, where that title comes from actually is a blog post that the React team published back in the very early days of React itself. And the purpose of the post was to help developers come up with the design issues that I mentioned there at the outset. Because remember, React was very different, as I've mentioned a number of times, from all of its competitors at the time. It didn't follow MVC. It introduced this idea of components. All of these things were new. And so developers weren't sure how they should structure their code. So the article Thinking in React gave us a kind of a process that we follow in order to come up with a hierarchical component structure with some components being stateful and stateless and all of those objectives. And so in summary, kind of the article came up with these steps that you go through. So it's a process, and like all processes, it is iterative. So you may find yourself at step 4 and having to go back to step 2, and that's fine. That's understandable. So I'm going to talk my way through these steps, give you an idea of what's associated with each one of them. And I've tried to follow this process to a degree anyway in the labs so that you get a real life kind of illustration of it. Certainly the earlier parts of the steps of the process are followed in the labs connected with the Movies app. Now, before we look at the process, the assumption is that as your starting point, you already have a kind of a mock-up of the UI for your application, whether that be on pen and paper, or you've used some tool to sketch out what the look and feel of the UI is going to be. So that's your starting point. You may also have an understanding of the nature of the data that the React app is going to be using in terms of a web API now. You may or may not have that. In the case of the movie app, we do, because the TMDB API is fully developed for us. But in some cases where you're developing, you may be developing both the front end and the back end of an application, or you may be part of a team where one part of the team is developing the back end, another subset of the team is developing the front end. And so the back end may not be completed before you begin your front end development. So that's kind of optional, but you certainly have number 1 there in that list. And so according to the process, step 1 is we need to come up with a component hierarchy. And just for illustration purposes, we're going to go back to our filtered friends little case study. Okay, we know what the end result of this is going to be, but just to explain the kind of steps of the process that you go through in order to come up with the hierarchy, what you do is you look at the UI and you try and break it up into logical kind of sections, and you draw boxes around those sections, and you're kind of aiming to have boxes within boxes. That's kind of the end result of this this part of the process anyway. So in that sense, as we look at the UI, well, whenever you've got a list of things in the UI, you kind of automatically draw a box around that. And that's kind of now saying that in my component hierarchy, I am going to have a component that's just going to be responsible for generating the list of things. Whenever you've got a list, you also draw a box around one entry in that list. This is saying that you're going to have a component that's just going to be responsible for rendering one item from the list. And already now I've got a box within a box, and that's kind of what I'm aiming for. I might then decide, well, I'm going to actually have a component that's going to be responsible for managing the user input side of things in this UI. And that's about it really, apart from the header. So by default, you kind of put a box around the entire UI. And so I finished up now with my kind of boxes within boxes objective. And we take that, and from that, it's quite easy to come up with the diagram on the left. Okay, and so each component now on the hierarchy on the left, each component corresponds to one of my boxes that I've drawn on the UI on the right. And I think it's pretty obvious what box on the right corresponds to what component on the left. It's important now that you don't start drifting into thinking about, well, which of my components are stateful at this stage. I've purposefully left that out of the diagram on the left there. We're not worried about state at all at this stage. We're just worried about, or we're just concerned with coming up with a component hierarchy. And we've done that. Okay, just to go back to the previous slide, like I said, maybe having a knowledge of the nature of the web API that's supplying data to you and the structure of that data, that may be useful at this stage. I don't think it is as useful, certainly as looking at the mock UI, but it may be. In the context of the filtered friends, really this part of the hierarchy does kind of correspond to the nature of the data supplied from our web API, in that the web API provides a list of friends. So it kind of corresponds to that part of the component hierarchy. Okay. Let's take another example that we haven't seen. So my kind of vision here now for this app that I want to develop, which happens to be related to movies again, but not that I'm a movie buff by any means, but let me explain what my vision here is. So the idea here is, and let's assume that we're using TMDB as our backend as well, just for because we know about it. So in this part of the UI for this app would be a list of movies, just maybe movie titles would be listed here. And the titles would be clickable, okay, which is important in a moment. And I guess this area is scrollable as well. I've also got the ability to filter this list of movies by means of some user input here. Again, it might be a text box, drop-down menu, doesn't really matter, but there is some sort of filtering capability here to allow me to filter the list of movies. Over here on the left, the idea is that in this box here, I would display information about the particular movie that has been clicked from this list, okay? And as to what information is displayed inside here, that is also dependent on which of these buttons the user has clicked. So as a user, you'd select your movie, then you might click description. And so here we would get the plot associated with the movie. You might also select cast, and then you get the detail of the cast, and so on for the other buttons. Yeah. So that's how it's meant to work, and that's the UI side of it. Let's come up with a component hierarchy for that. So we're starting with a blank page, and by default, now in terms of having boxes within boxes, you can kind of either work from the outside in or the inside out, or work in both directions. It doesn't really matter. But I guess by default, we're going to have a box around the entire UI, because and that box is going to correspond to the top component of my hierarchy. Moving on, well, I guess there's a kind of section on the left of the UI, and there's a section on the right. So I'll put a box around both of those. Taking the box on the right, digging into that a little bit more detail. Well, I've got a list of things, so I'm going to put a box around the list of movies. Whenever we've got a list of things, we also have a box corresponding to rendering one entry in that list. And I'm also going to put a box around that part of the UI that concerns with the filtering logic. So that's dealt with everything on the right-hand side. Moving over to the left-hand side, I guess it's fairly obvious. I would have a box around the part that displays information about the movie. And I'm going to put a box around my list of buttons. Now, okay, it's a list of buttons. Should we have a box for each button? Yeah, maybe, maybe not. The buttons would tend to be very different in nature, but that's maybe a decision you could make later on once you've got some coding done and maybe done some refactoring as a result. Also, it's kind of a good idea in general because any kind of web app that you develop, there will be kind of a header section in the UI. So by default, we kind of tend to have a component that's just going to be responsible for rendering the header. So I'll have a box for the header, and there may be a footer part as well that you want to have kind of consistent across all the different views or pages that make up your app, even though I'm not dealing with multiple pages now in this example, but it's just a good practice to have by default a header and footer box, which will correspond to a component just responsible for rendering the header and footer part of the UI. So that's everything covered now. I have broken up my UI into logical kind of sections, and the boxes represent the that sectioning. And so again, I think it should be hopefully straightforward to go from what you have there to this. Okay. I didn't fully label this hierarchy now, but you know, apart from some of the labels, and some of the labels wouldn't really be very good component names, but they serve the purpose of relating this hierarchy to the previous screen. So, I'm hoping that you will understand that, for example, this component here is the one that's going to be displaying, managing the display of the list of movies. This component corresponds to rendering one movie in the list. This is the component that manages the filtering of the filtering inputs. This is the component that is responsible for displaying information on the movie. This is the component that manages all of the buttons. Yeah. And the other components then are fairly obvious what their role is. So again, I've come up with a component hierarchy. I know what each component in the hierarchy is responsible for in terms of what it renders onto the screen. I don't know anything about state or any of those issues yet though. So that's step one. Oh yeah, in the movies app, I kind of applied the same process of drawing boxes around sections of the UI, and so you know this already now from the lab, the movies lab part 1, I think, is where I cover this. So that kind of breakdown there would correspond roughly to a component hierarchy like this. Yeah. As well, I suppose once you've done that, you may still decide that some of the components in your hierarchy may need to be further broken down, and that's fine. So maybe there's a component that actually just when you start to code it, you'll find that there's just too much going on. It has physically got too much code maybe associated with it. And you may decide to break that component up into some subcomponents, that's fine. Or you may decide that one of the components in your hierarchy, it actually has more than one responsibility. And we don't like that. We like components just to have a single responsibility. So either way, it's fine to take the hierarchy that you have produced and subsequently kind of decide that some of the components still need to be broken down for whatever reason, any one of the 3 reasons that I mentioned there. So that's step one. Step two then is, now we haven't written a line of code yet. Okay, that's important. We haven't done any implementation yet. Step two is where you begin your implementation. And it's really important that at this stage, you just don't worry about the dynamics side of your app. All you're interested in is just getting a static version of the UI working. And it's a good point or a good stage to start using Storybook. So what I would suggest is that you kind of take the what I'm calling the leaf components. They're the ones that kind of at the bottom of your hierarchy. Take those components because you know what each of the components is linked to in terms of what it should render. Take each of the leaf components and implement those and get Storybook to render those components for you so that you at least get that working. So in the context of the movies app, you would implement the movie card, the movie list, the filter controls. Only take the components at the bottom, towards the bottom end of the hierarchy though. Um, don't have user stories, don't have Storybook rendering the entire UI page, if you like. That's not really what Storybook is meant to be for. It's meant to only be concerned with rendering kind of low-level components in your hierarchy. And as well, it may be what you will also decide when you're using Storybook is, or you should be able to kind of work out what props the components, the low-level components actually require. And thirdly, it may be a case where some components may have multiple stories or multiple renderings depending on the values of the props. So those kind of decisions can be made at this stage as well. Depending on whether you have an actual API to work with, you may not, you don't have to. Just a sample data set would be fine, and you would just hard code the sample data set and feed that into your components. But what's really important there is the bit at the end of the sentence there, the last sentence, which is, do not start thinking about the interactivity aspects of your UI. That's kind of reinforced by this next line, which is really your components at this stage now, all they should have is the return statement and the JSX. They should not have hooks. They shouldn't have event handlers. They should not have any kind of computation going on inside the components. That's for much later in the process. If you find yourself introducing them at this stage, then you need to just take a step back and suspend that stuff for later on. And really kind of the objective here is that we're decoupling the structural side of our React app from the interactive dynamic aspects of it. This little catchphrase is kind of nice, like while you might be writing a lot of code at this stage, mainly JSX code, admittedly, it's going to be pretty straightforward. So it's not going to be very taxing to actually get that JSX correct. So you're doing a lot of typing, but very little thinking because, again, there's no real dynamics going on in the app. And it's the dynamic and runtime behavior of React apps that require a little bit more thought, really, and reflection to get it working right. Okay, so we have a component hierarchy, and we've written stories for loads of low-level components. Now we have also hooked up the components to go back to the previous one. We've also kind of hooked the components up together so that we are rendering the entire UI page or UI view. So you would still be using Create React App, for example, at this stage, once you've done some Storybook coding. you would bring in create React app and get it to assemble the components together to get it to display the entire UI view, if you like. But it's still a static UI. So now we're moving on to step 3, where we start thinking about state. Now, in step 3, all we're really interested in is identifying where is their state within our UI. We're not actually concerned yet with deciding which components are stateful and stateless. But I'm also saying there in the title that we want to identify the minimal but complete representation of UI state. So state is something we want to keep to a minimum. The more state that you have, really, the more complicated your application is in terms of managing that state and understanding the runtime behavior of your whole UI. So we want to keep state as minimal as possible, but still sufficient to completely represent the UI's state aspects. I've already sort of said in previous lectures, when it comes to the stage of deciding about stateless components and stateful components, we want to have as many of the components as possible to be stateless. You can think of stateless components really as components that just receive props and they render those props. That's kind of all they do. They don't tend to have much behavior. They don't tend to have dynamics associated with them. The second point, well, I'm sure you've heard of the drive principle, don't repeat yourself. And what we're getting at there is don't have a state variable which can be computed from another state variable. That wouldn't be considered the minimal representation of state. If one state variable can be computed from another one, then take the one that's computed and remove that and just do the computation every time you need to within your JavaScript code. I'm also saying there at in the last bullet point that a common pattern is to have a stateful component that computes the props for its subordinates based on its state variables and some domain data and props that it receives. So in other words, if you can think about it, if you can visualize a stateful component, it could be in the middle of your hierarchy. And therefore, if it's in the middle of the hierarchy, it's receiving props. It may also be interacting with your web API, so it's receiving domain data. And it's using its props and its domain data that it receives to compute and as well, sorry, number 3, and any of its state variables. It's using those 3 sources to compute the props that it passes down for its subordinates. That tends to be typically what a stateful component is concerned with. Now, question is though, how do we identify UI state? Haven't still addressed that. Sometimes it's good to understand what shouldn't be UI state. The first thing is, I think I've mentioned before, anything that could be computed at runtime, that computed data should not be stored typically as a state variable in a component, right? So in terms of the filtered friends app that we had, we computed the list of matching friends, but we didn't store that computed list of matching friends as state. We just computed it every time we needed to. Number 2, a component that receives props, you would very rarely be storing those props as state within the component. If you find yourself doing that, then you probably need to take a step back and ask yourself, why are you doing that, or do you need to do that? So don't store props as state variables within a component. There is one rare case where you may need to do that. If a component needs to know the current value of its props and the previous value of the props in order to do some sort of computation, then in that rare case, well, it may not be that rare, but in that case, you would actually store props as state variables. Number 3 might seem unusual, but a component is nothing. I mean, you can assign a component to a variable. So if you can assign a component to a variable, then it could potentially be stored as a state variable. But that again is something that is very rare. And again, if you find yourself doing it, then you need to take a step back. And I'm saying there as well that really state is always something that can be kind of JSON serializable, which a component can't be really. Now, number 4 actually seems unusual because I have broken rule number 4 myself already. I'm saying domain data should not be stored as a state variable. Domain data is the data that you receive from your web API. We could also refer to it as model data. If you remember the model view controller pattern, the M part of that. So model data, domain data, web API data, all different terms for the same thing. You should not store that data as state variables. Now, if you think of the filtered friends application, that's exactly what I did. When I received the list of friends from the random user API, I actually stored the full list of friends in a state variable in the top component in my hierarchy, I think. The reason I had to do that is because there's another aspect of React that we haven't covered, but we will, I think probably in the very last lecture. And when I do cover that other aspect of React, it's something called React context. When we look at React context, then we can move domain data away from an ordinary component and move it into what's referred to as a context area. Another solution to not storing domain data in a component is to use some sort of third-party state management modules, as they're termed. The most common one that you might come across when you read about React is a third-party kind of framework, really, called Redux. And Redux is a framework just for managing domain data or model data linked to a React app. So apart from number 4 there, 1, 2, and 3 are definitely things that you can relate to at this stage. So they're all the things that should not go into a state variable. What should go to be state variables? Well, certainly the first one there, any kind of user input, we tend to store that as state data within a component, whether that be text boxes, selecting from a drop-down menu, clicking a radio button, all those kind of user inputs, they need to be stored as state variables somewhere within some component. Another way of thinking about that is any kind of event handlers. Event handlers tend to want to change the state of either its own component or its parent component. So event handlers also are kind of tightly connected with this notion of state and state variables. But certainly the first one there, I think, is the best kind of guideline to go by. Anywhere there's user input in your UI, then that user input will be linked to the state, a state variable for some component. Again, remember now at step 3, we're not concerned with linking the state to a particular component. All we're interested in is identifying where is there state within our UI layout. Finally, the blog post, this Thinking in React blog post, gave us this kind of suggestion as to how we identify UI state. And it just kind of says to just take a step back, look at the UI layout, identify everywhere on the UI where there is actual data, and then ask yourself these kind of 3 questions about each piece of data on the UI. So number one is this data passed in as a prop? Because remember now at this stage, we know what the component hierarchy is. We know what a component's props are. And so if you're looking at the actual UI layout, the mock UI, you've identified a piece of data, you know which component is responsible for rendering that part of the UI. And just ask yourself, well, is that data passed in as a prop to the component? And if it is, then it's not state, because as I said on the previous slide, we don't store props in state typically. The second question is the really useful one, I think there. Is the data that you, particular data item that you've identified on the UI, is it modifiable or can the user interact with it? And if the answer to that question is yes, then it is very much a candidate for UI state. The third one, kind of already mentioned, can the data that you've identified on the UI, can it be computed? If it can, then it's not state. Okay, so putting all of that kind of together, if you think of the filtered friends, really, and if you think of the UI of the filtered friends in terms of the data that appeared on the UI, the only data that will really transpire to state is the text box. But just in terms of data, we had a list of friends. Well, the list of friends, the full list of friends actually is domain data or model data. It came from the web API, and we've already said you shouldn't store that as state, even though I did store it as state, but I've already explained why I had to. Number two there, the search box or the search text, that's data. But it's modifiable, so it's very much a candidate for UI state. Number three, the filtered list of friends, that's actually computed, and anything that's computed should not be stored in UI state. And number four, if you took any particular friend displayed on the UI, like their name and their email, that's data as well, but that was actually data that was passed in as props to the friend component, if you remember. So it wouldn't be state either. Now, maybe this is the best example of trying to explain this notion of identifying state within your UI. And so this is harping back now to this little sample app that we discussed earlier on. So in terms of data, well, the list of movies being displayed, that's data. And because the user can interact with any of the movies on the list, they can click them, okay, by selecting them. Then because it's we can interact with it, then that is a candidate for state data. That's number one. Number two, well, this is clearly going to be a state UI state data, because again, the data that we enter here is modifiable. Yeah, so that's also definitely a candidate for UI state data. And thirdly, the buttons on the left can be interacted with by the user, so they are also state. It would correspond to state data. Like the information that's displayed here, the information about a movie, that's not really going to be state, because that's actually computed. It's computed based on what movie was selected, what button was pressed, and the actual contents of this area here would more than likely be retrieved from the web API that's behind this user interface. Yeah. So I am suggesting that this UI has three aspects to its UI state data. Step 4 then is to decide, well, which component should manage that state data. And it's going to be more than one component. This is quite easy, I think, really, step 4. Step 3 is the tricky part. So you may find yourself going from step 3 to step 4, back to step 3 again, and that's okay. But assuming that we have identified the parts of the UI that contains UI state data, we now need to allocate that state data to particular components. And so all you do is you identify each component in the hierarchy that needs to know the value, the current value of the state data, because presumably it uses it to do some sort of computation. So you might have identified for a particular piece of state data, you might have identified 2 or 3 components that need to know the current value of it. And so you take those subset of components and you identify a common ancestor of all of those 3 components, or whatever number there are. So you kind of climb up the component hierarchy to find one common ancestor. And it's that common ancestor component that is going to be the one that is going to manage that particular state variable. And that's the component that will have the useState hook coded in it. Okay. So to apply step 4 to our sample app, and we have our hierarchy here now. So if we take each of the 3 state data that we identified from step 3. So first of all, the filtering input, this is actually the component, if you can remember, this is the component that manages the filtering input part of our UI. And it had state data, which I'm just representing like this. So clearly this component needs to know about the current value of the filtering input because it just displays it. This component here as well also needs to know it because it uses the filtering, the current value of the various filtering inputs to decide on the list of movies that should be displayed. Okay, so it uses it to compute what's going on here. So these 2 components, I'm saying, need to know the current value of the filtering input. And a common ancestor of both of those is this component itself. So my way of representing state here now is by putting a box around the state variable. So this is telling me this component is a stateful component, and its state variable is going to contain the current values of the various filtering inputs that the user has typed in. Moving on to the movie selection. When the user clicks a movie, well, the particular component that displays the movie name, it needs to know that it has been clicked, maybe because it changes its background color to something else to highlight that it has been selected. So this component needs to know what movie has been clicked. And I'm also saying that this component way over here on the left, it needs to know which movie was selected. And that's because this one determines what should be displayed in the display area based on what movie was selected, if you remember. Yeah. So if this component and this component both need to know the current value of the selected movie, then the common ancestor of both of those is this guy at the very top. So this is now going to be a stateful component, and one of its state variables will contain, I don't know, maybe the ID of the movie, the current movie that has been selected by the user or clicked by the user. The third state variable was the button state variable. This component is going to need to know which button was clicked because this component actually manages the buttons. So it needs to know, it will record, it needs to know which one was clicked again, maybe because it might change the coloring of the button that was clicked. This component also needs to note because it uses both the selected button and the selected movie to determine what should be displayed in the display area on the left-hand side. And so the common ancestor of these two is this one. So we finish up with three stateful components, this one, and this one. And that's very kind of typical. Our state is scattered around the place. All of the other components are stateless. This just talks you through the similar kind of process with the filtered friends. So you can read through that yourselves. I don't need to go over that again, I think. And we're kind of nearly there now, really. So we have our component hierarchy. We've identified the stateful components within that hierarchy. We know what each state variable is representing. So what's next is in the process is adding this inverse data flow or this data down action up code pattern to our implementation. And if you remember, this inverse data flow is all about where you have a situation where a stateful component, it's the current value of the state variable in the stateful component is actually determined by an event that occurs in a subordinate component. Okay, and we've got a couple of instances of that in our sample movie app that we're looking at in this set of slides. And we know what the solution is, this idea of passing a callback function down to the component that actually catches the event that triggers the state change. So we know this already. And to relate it to this hierarchy, so we just take two of the state variables, the filtering and the movie selection. So this is the component that will handle the user entering filtering input. But this component needs to know about it because it uses it for computation purposes. So what I'm trying to represent by this arrow is that this component needs to pass a callback function as a prop down to this component. And whenever the user changes the filtering input, the event handler associated with the user changing the input, that event handler is going to call the function that was passed down to it effectively to inform this component that it needs to change its state variable and the whole re-rendering, etc., that goes on with that. Now, the other example that I'm going to look at is more extreme. So this is the component down here that handles the event associated with the user selecting one of the movies in the list. But this is the component, this component needs to know about the change in the movie selection. So it needs to pass a callback function from this component to this one, to this one, to this one. Okay. Now the function that's being passed down here, it's only this component actually uses it. These intermediate ones don't use it at all. And that's not a nice kind of design, or that is a kind of a design flaw. What it's referred to as prop drilling. And that's it really. That's kind of the process that you go through. So as I say, I think 1 and 2 are easy enough to follow and very useful. 3 and 4, you would tend to oscillate between them because I think identifying state is one of the tricky bits, and indeed you may find yourself having gone all the way down to step 5 and still realizing that you're missing a particular piece of state in a component. So as I said at the outset, it is an iterative process. So that's about it for the whole kind of design process. Okay, thanks for now.